The care and growth model is based on the insight that the fundamental criteria that are operative in any relationship, and certainly in a command relationship, is the issue of intent. And the issue of intent can pan in one of two ways. You're either concerned with what you're getting from the other or what you should be giving to the other. There has to be a relationship between one's intention and one's attention, because in a sense what's important to one is what one will give attention to. So if we say that the leader is here to give to a subordinate, and that giving is the care and growth of the subordinate, it would obviously mean that that's what the leader would give attention to. There's a relationship between one's intention and one's attention, and there's a relationship between one's attention and what one spends time on. If one considers this and we reflect on Stephen Covey's time management model, we know that this is a 4-quadrant model that says that things are either urgent or not urgent, or they're important or not important. And therefore it creates these 4 quadrants, and each one of them, in a sense, have different implications in terms of how one deals with the issue of time. The first quadrant that Stephen Covey describes, he calls it quadrant 1, are all, if you like, all activities that are concerned with outcomes. They're results-focused activities. They're really concerned with the deadlines and crises, and fundamentally they are all constructed around what one's getting from the other, the outcome you're trying to manage from the other. And the reason why this quadrant, if you like, is pregnant with crisis is fundamentally, if you want something from the other, you have no power. The other has power. So as soon as you deal with the world on the basis of what you want from the world, you are by definition in crisis. The next quadrant that I'd like to discuss, Covey calls quadrant 3, and he describes this quadrant as that which is urgent but not important. And in a sense, these are things that make an urgent demand for attention, but in fact aren't particularly significant. And if one considers corporate life, meetings, and a lot of meetings have that effect. You know, the things in your diary, you have to get there, but you get into the meeting and you sit for 2 hours and you don't say a word. In a sense, you've added no value, but your whole experience is that I've got to get to the meeting, I'm late for the meeting. Calls are like that. Very often you're dealing with something important and the telephone rings, and there's almost a pull of your attention from the activity that you were on to the insistent ringing of the phone. So quadrant 3 activities are activities that are based on those things that make an urgent demand for attention, but they're not actually particularly important. Quadrant 4 activities are literally time wasters. So they in a corporate life, it would be things like playing solitaire, or some meetings have that character. In other words, they add absolutely no value. They're not important or urgent. Now, I've deliberately left the significant quadrant for last, which Stephen Covey refers to as quadrant 2 activities. And he calls these activities sharpening the saw activities. They're activities that are important, but they're never presented as urgent. And he uses a metaphor for this. He says, imagine you walking through a forest and you come across a woodcutter who's cutting down a wood with a blunt saw. And he's clearly not getting anywhere. The tree's not coming down because the saw's blunt. Clearly the advice to the woodcutter would be sharpen the saw. However, for him to sharpen the saw, he's got to take his attention off the activity of cutting down the tree. In other words, the activity that's concerned with the result that he's trying to achieve, and he's got to give attention to the process of cutting. In other words, the sharpening of the saw. Now, our argument is that these sharpening of the saw activities therefore suggest a shift of attention from outcome, from the result you're trying to achieve, to process. In other words, sharpening or enabling the process that you engage in order to achieve the outcome. That shift of attention from outcome into process is actually very consistent with a shift of intention from taking to giving. You remember we spoke about the means and ends exercise, and we said if we look at the 2 examples, if I say to Tony, in 1980 I did what you'd have to do and what I did work, don't argue with me, shut up and go and do what I did, Tony would be resistant. And if I told Fred in 1980 I did what you have to do now and what I did worked, he'd probably be far more positive about this. We also said the key to the distinction between these isn't just that Tony experiences me as rude and Fred experiences me as more courteous or democratic almost in my behavior. The difference is at a deeper level. It's actually about means and ends. If we separate means and ends and we put into those two categories either the person is doing the job or the job that's being done, and we examine the Tony interaction, what becomes apparent is that my aim in the Tony interaction is to use Tony as my means in order to get the job done. However, if we have a look at the Fred interaction, if we assume that I'm being sincere with Fred, if I said to him, look, in 1980 I did this, take a look at it, it might be useful to you, it suggests that we could have a completely different outcome from what we had in 1980. In other words, the job or the outcome could be a catastrophe. In this instance, my intent with Fred is to use the job as my means in order to teach Fred something. And we argued that inversion of means and ends helps us to understand the key to this distinction between the Tony and Fred interaction, because the key lies at the level of intent. My intent in the Tony interaction is to take something from him, and my intent in the Fred interaction is to give him something. Now, if we for a moment just viewed the person as the means and the job as the end, and say, well, can that shift also be a shift of attention, and could that then affect any activity? Then I think it can. I mean, if we considered an activity of walking up the mountain, I'm walking up the mountain, and I can use my attention while I'm walking up the mountain in a very similar way to how I used my attention with either the Tony or the Fred interaction. And in order to understand what this means, we need to replace the word person, wherever we see the word person with the idea of walking, and the job or the outcome as the top of the mountain. Now, if one therefore looks at the Tony interaction, if you say, well, I'm walking in order to get to the top of the mountain, the walking is the means, and the top of the mountain is the end. However, in the Fred interaction, what I'm actually doing is my aim, my end is to walk well, and the top of the mountain is almost my excuse to walk well. So in a sense, the top of the mountain is my means to walk well. So there's a shift there's an inversion of means and ends in this activity of walking that's consistent with the shift of my intention from the Tony to the Fred interaction. And that suggests that being here to give indicates a shift of attention from outcome into process. Now, if one considers, well, what's the leader's process, then it becomes apparent that the leader does try and achieve an outcome or a result. But his contribution, his process, is to do some tasks himself and to give his subordinate the means, the ability, and the accountability for the subordinate to do what's required of them. The leader's process is therefore concerned with activities aimed at the care and growth of the subordinate. So when the leader sharpens his saw, when the leader looks at his process and improves his process, he is either doing the task that he does himself better, or he's giving means, ability, or accountability to a subordinate. That suggests that when the leader gives time to things, then that's what he would give time to. So if we translate this back into Covey's time management model, what becomes apparent is that the sharpening of the saw of the leader is the care and growth of subordinates. The practical implication of this is the following. If you took the care and growth of your subordinate seriously, this would become apparent in what you give attention to. It would actually become apparent in what's in your diary. This has both a diagnostic and a remedial insight. Diagnostically, the key issue is to look at what you're giving attention to currently and what's in your diary, and to ask yourself how many of those activities are really concerned with caring for your subordinate and giving your subordinate the means, the ability, and the accountability to do what's required of them. What this means remedially is that you consider what the care, the means, the ability, and the accountability variables are that you have to address with each immediate subordinate. And you deliberately drop them in as events in your diary over time. So it ensures that you're giving attention to the appropriate things.